Good evening and very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. Delighted to see so many of you here on such a glorious evening when it'd be lovely to be outside as well. Particularly glad to welcome Richard Susskind, CBE. Richard is an old friend. He's been at the forefront of thinking for over 25 years about the intersection of technology and law and broader impact on society. And together with his son, Daniel, who was also at Oxford, did a book on the future of professions. And now he's turned his mind to a subject which concerns us all, which is how do we make sense of AI? What do we think about it? How should we evaluate it? What are the ethical, societal, and other implications? And it's something which I feel is absolutely central to this century. And of course, that's why the Oxford Martin School was established by James Martin 20 years ago to think about the great challenges of this century. So it couldn't be more timely and apposite to be talking about a subject than this. How to think about it. Richard will be signing his books for sale in the cafeteria afterwards, and you're all invited to join us for a drink and to get one of his books then. Richard, for 25 years, was the Lord Chief Justice's technology advisor. Since last year, he's been the special envoy for justice and AI to the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and he's written 11 books and is a regular columnist for The Times and Times Radio and others. Absolutely delighted to have you here, Richard. And what we're going to do is Richard's going to introduce the book. I'm going to have a brief conversation with him, and then there'll be time for both the many people joining online and those in the room to ask questions. So, Richard, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. Professor Goldin, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're kind to me on the question of passage of time. In fact, I wrote my PhD, or my DPhil, I should say, on AI and law here at Oxford from 1983 to 1986, which rather brands me of a certain vintage. But I have been thinking about AI for most of my life, and so I thought I would put my thoughts down on paper, which is essentially why I'm here this evening. I want to go back, though, to 1970. In fact, the year before, a man called Marvin Minsky, who in 1969 was awarded the Turing Prize. Some say it's like the Nobel Prize for computer scientists. And the following year, in 1970, he said something like this to Life magazine. He said, the next generation of machines will be so intelligent, we'll be lucky if they keep us around as household pets. And I used to think that was really amusing, and now I think it's less amusing. In 1986, the New Scientists were bolder in the other direction. They said that AI's record of barefaced public deception was unparalleled in the annals of academic study. AI has always divided human beings, and we saw a recurrence of this division when ChatGPT was launched, this generative AI system that has engendered, I think rightly, so much interest and enthusiasm, and to some extent concern as well. Henry Kissinger, writing with a couple of computer specialists in the Wall Street Journal not long after ChatGPT was launched, suggested that this would change the very fabric of reality. Noam Chomsky, also writing with computer scientists, but in the New York Times, dismissed ChatGPT as trivial. And I've always been fascinated by the polarization to which AI seems to give rise. It's almost as if people are a member of a football support club. You either support AI or you don't support AI. And more than that, you feel very strongly about it. So I say it's long divided humans. And one of the things I wanted to do was make sense of how it could be that some of our cleverest people were thinking so differently about artificial intelligence. And that really was the origin of the book. I did my own experiment with ChatGPT not long after it came out. As Ian mentioned, I write regularly for The Times, and they said, could I write an article for The Times on the impact of artificial intelligence in law? So I went to ChatGPT and I said, could you please draft 800 words on the impact of AI on the legal profession in the words of and based on the research of Richard Susskind. And so I look at what comes up, and as we all do, quite always slightly dismissive, oh, it's okay, but it's not nearly as good as the real thing, was my initial reaction. 6 months later, I tried it again with what was then GPT-4. And I looked on screen at its response to me. And for the first time, a shiver ran up my spine. Because this really could have been a first draft by me. And I reflected that day, as our machines are becoming increasingly capable. By the time we get, at least conceptually, to GPT-6, there'll be no need for me to be writing columns in the Times. And in fact, we'll probably look back on it. I think it's rather ridiculous that one person writes about an issue. Why wouldn't you say, write a column, The Future of AI and Law, based on the work of the top 50 people in the country, and write it in the style of Martin Amis, a proper author, rather than me. There's all sorts of ways you could imagine it being better. And my mind was opened up. But at the same time, I thought, and this is a lesson for all of us in any form of business, is I think the market will show no loyalty to our traditional ways of working if AI systems can produce an outcome, an output that is quicker, cheaper, better, and so forth. So I felt at once inspired, but also unsettled, again reflecting this tension we find in the world of AI. When I started digging around, thinking about what I might put in this book, I came across, and I'd been vaguely interested in this for a while, the whole area of brain-computer interface. Very conscious, there's probably specialists in the field in this very room. But I'll give you a crude rendition of a published experiment that caught my eye. There were 29 patients suffering from epilepsy. And for the purposes of monitoring their brain activity while they were unwell, they had attached electrodes to the surface of their brains, many thousands attached to the 29 patients. And they tried an experiment. They played the 29 patients the same piece of music separately. And they captured the data, the brain activity, as they were listening to the music. And using a variety of AI techniques, a system was able to reproduce the music that, I'm terribly conscious of not using human terms, but reproduced the music that was consistent with the brain activity, using a whole bundle, as I say, of AI techniques. And you can listen to it on the web. It's recognizably, but spookily, Another Brick in the Wall by Pink Floyd. And I found this just completely amazing. The idea that a machine can be monitoring brain activity and can in some way reproduce the experience of these humans. And when I put these kinds of stories together, the writing of the newspaper column on the one hand, the brain-computer interface, the feeling that everyone had when ChatGPT came out, here suddenly was a remarkable system that could draft documents, summarize documents, compare documents. It was a question-answer system. It could seemingly do bits of research. It could create line drawings, music, video, and terribly important, it itself could produce code. The question that I was getting asked when I was speaking informally about the advance of AI was, where's this all going to end? Where is it leading us? So that was another question I sought to answer in the book. And I have to say, and I say it right at the outset, that I suspect I ask far more questions than I answer in the book. What I'm trying to do is at least bring some clarity to the questions, trying to identify the questions we should be seeking to answer. And when I was reflecting on where this is heading, again, I was looking at what's been written for some time about the explosive exponential growth in the underpinning technologies. We know, whether it's bandwidth, the hard disk capacity, or memory or processing power, we've known about this explosive growth. And now we learn that the computing resource available to train, to build essentially these AI systems is doubling every 6 months, which means over a 10-year period, we'll see 20 doublings, 2 to the power 20. That's a 1 million-fold increase in the computing resource available to train these systems. So we can, and I think should, be amazed at what these systems are currently doing. But we should be more amazed, it seems to me, at the advance of the underpinning technology and therefore the inevitability of these systems that seem to be becoming more advanced. There is no apparent finishing line here. No one in Silicon Valley or China or South Korea is dusting their hands off and saying, job done, we've done AI now. Quite the reverse. The pace of change, the scale of investment is increasing. And another phenomenon that's troubled me for some time, because it is in one sense so unscientific, and yet it seems to me it's not just about extrapolating, it's also about speculating when we think about the future. The idea of what I call not yet invented technologies. If most of us, even those of us involved with AI, had assembled before ChatGPT, we had a view about the potential of AI and the speed with which it was advancing. And then ChatGPT came along and it was transformational in the same way as so many technologies have been transformational, whether it be the web, whether it be the iPhone, whether it be all manner of social media, all unanticipated systems that change the way we live and labor. And I think it is irresponsible to think of a future that is simply a better set of the current technologies. I believe, I can't prove this, but when I look at the trajectories, I believe our lives will be fundamentally transformed by 2030 by techniques and technologies that haven't yet been developed. I can't prove that, but everything I look at suggests that trajectory. In the early years of AI, 50s, 60s, 70s, we saw breakthroughs every 5 to 10 years. We're having breakthroughs every 6 to 12 months just now, not just in the enabling technologies, but actually in the applications, the uses and so forth. So we live in this remarkable time when there's no finishing line. These as yet not invented technologies hover, it seems to me, in the air, about to change how it is that we interact with technology. And again, I asked the question, where is it going to end? So I thought, why don't I have a look at what's being written across the AI literature, and why do I speak to so many people in the AI industry and identify some kind of consensus in the future of AI? But that led me, in fact, to identify, and this is a subjective piece of analysis by me, but I found 6 different hypotheses about the future of AI, and I'll run through them briefly. The first I call the hype hypothesis. And this runs something like this. People say these systems are simply superficially impressive. It's superficial because they make mistakes. People like to say, wrong use of the term in my view, but they like to say they hallucinate. They will say the systems, the data on which these systems rely is irredeemably biased. And therefore, after a couple of years, we will find that economically, we have to have humans in the loop, we have to have humans checking if we're going to use these systems in critical situations, and that'll be a roadblock. And so the bubble will burst, there'll be a return of what people like to call an AI winter, and we'll look back and smile and think that that was an anomaly in the progress of humanity, nothing significant, but certainly not as transformational as many people are anticipating. That's the hype hypothesis. The second hypothesis I call the Gen AI plus hypothesis. Generative AI, that's what we have today, and that's what I say we should all be amazed by what it does. This hypothesis holds that within a number of years, we will invest sufficiently in overcoming the current problems and shortcomings, that is critical to the success of this vast AI market. And we will, in one way or another, this is the hypothesis, find ways of detecting and reducing the bias and of eliminating the errors. But the Gen AI hypothesis says that's about as far as AI will go. So what we're seeing today is an early version of as far as AI will take us. That's to say, we'll have the similar kinds of tools, but they'll be reliable. That'll be us. The third hypothesis is the AGI hypothesis. And this is where it gets interesting in my view, and also gets controversial. So AGI is artificial general intelligence in the crudest of terms. This means that systems can perform all or almost all the cognitive tasks that humans can undertake. In crude terms, again, they're as bright, they're as able, as intelligent, as capable as us intellectually. That's the broad thesis. Now, if you'd ask most people in the IT AI development world, pre-ChatGPT, how long do you think it will be before we have AGI? Most would have said, or did say, 20 to 40 years, if ever. If you ask that same question of those people involved in AI development today, most say 5 to 10 years, and in private, they're more inclined to say 5 years. And what I can't understand is why people aren't completely stunned and amazed by that proposition. That most of the people, and I know they're not objective commentators in their own industry, and I know there's a tendency towards hype, but there is such a wide degree of consensus within those people who are involved with AI development that these systems will be advancing so rapidly within the next few years. I say we're entirely ill-prepared in business and government and education for that as a possibility. That's AGI, and we're only halfway through the hypothesis. The fourth hypothesis is the superintelligence hypothesis. And to understand that, you need to go back to the mid-60s when a man called Jonathan Good said that, and many people have echoed this over the last few years, that if we do indeed invent machines that can match human intellect, then that will be the last invention we as humans need make, because what they had in mind there was systems that could then themselves develop systems, and in a kind of recursive, accelerated vortex systems, he said, that will give rise to, he called it an intelligence explosion, I would call it a capability explosion. But the net result, and this is at the heart of the superintelligence hypothesis, is that we will have systems that are not just matching human capability, but unfathomably more capable than us. The fifth hypothesis is the singularity hypothesis, popularized by a man called Ray Kurzweil. And I know there's many scholars dismiss Kurzweil. Since I was here in the 80s, I've been following his work. Remarkably prescient individual. He predicted at the turn of the century we would have AGI by 2029, which, as I say, is quite mainstream thinking amongst at least some AI scientists. He's not a person to be ignored. He believes by 2045 we'll have the singularity, and this, to some extent, vaguely defined, but it's captured for some people in the term transhumanism, that biological organic humans will, in some sense, merge with digital machines. We will become digitally enhanced. On one view, our conscious experience will be greatly expanded. Our intellectual capabilities will likewise be expanded. And this signals the end of the kinds of creatures we are. We're moving into a new era. That's the singularity hypothesis. And the final hypothesis is the AI evolution hypothesis, adhered to by very many significant cosmologists, scientists, physicists. I think perhaps best expressed by Lord Rees, who is the Astronomer Royal, or past president of the Royal Society, an eminent individual. And in his book, On the Future of Humanity, he says, and I paraphrase something like this, the known universe as we understand it is about 13.8 billion years old. Humanity's been around for a couple of 100,000 years. In cosmic terms, we are but a blink of the eye. And it may well be that the only contribution that humanity makes to the cosmos is to develop these intelligent systems that will, in due course, replace us. So I'm sorry to spoil your evening. But that's the final hypothesis. So there they are. The hype hypothesis, the Gen AI plus hypothesis, the AGI hypothesis, the superintelligence hypothesis, the singularity hypothesis, and the AI evolution hypothesis. So which should we prefer? And many of you in the room will have very strong views. I try not to, in the book, be too selective and say this is what I prefer, but I think in the end my prejudice leaks out. But let me say a little about how we should be thinking about this. I think the first thing is we need to distinguish between the advance of technology and the adoption of technology. And I know this so well in the world of law, where I've been laboring for years to get lawyers and judges to use technology, and just how long it takes. Culturally, right across the professions, we know from the work we did a decade ago, for example, doctors, lawyers, auditors, architects, we're all a conservative bunch. And so even if there are available technologies which could greatly enhance or even transform the way we work, we find all sorts of reasons for not using them. And some of these reasons are regulatory reasons, that we have in professional work, for example, what differentiates professions from others is that we are regulated, and to introduce a whole set of systems that undertake critical tasks of the professions would need a whole new regulatory regime. And I was saying in passing, and I say this as a former technology lawyer, that we have always said that the law lags about 10 years behind the technology. That's one of our big challenges in regulating AI. all I am saying at this stage is we cannot assume simply because a technology is available, it will necessarily be adopted or adopted quickly. And then there's a couple of prejudices. There's what I call not us thinking in the book. And we find this a lot when Daniel and I wrote our book that Ian kindly referred to, the Future of the Professions, and we interviewed people from 8 different professions. A universal response was that all this AI stuff was of relevance for all other professions other than their own. So we all do the special pleading. We all say, you don't really understand what goes on around here. You'll never have an AI system replacing us. But this not us thinking is irrational at best. And then there's a phenomenon that I think is absolutely crucial, and that's what I call technological myopia. And that is a strong tendency for people to evaluate the future potential of a technology in terms of today's limitations. So I read again and again on a daily basis about research which is showing the shortcomings of AI, and many scholars with glee finding yet another thing AI systems can't do, as if somehow that defines and limits and constrains AI for all time. On the other side of the coin, and I'll talk about this in a second, I look at the scale of the investment and the importance to the AI market of overcoming these problems. So somehow to think that our AI systems are stuck with the limitations of 2025 seems to me to be rather short-sighted. So what I try to do and look ahead and try to think what's likely to happen, I look at some of the drivers. I look at the trajectory of the breakthroughs. I've mentioned this, 5 to 10 years in the early years, perhaps 6 to 12 months today. I look at what Dan and I call the increasing capability of machines. Hardly a day passes we don't hear news about a system, a new system, a breakthrough, an app, a technology, a startup. And we're hearing news of systems that are doing more and more, and often indeed taking on tasks that we thought could only be undertaken by human beings. I look at this explosive, exponential increase in underpinning technologies. I look at what Kurzweil calls the law of accelerating returns, by which he's referring, and it's such an interesting phenomenon, to our current use of AI systems in the development of the next generation of AI systems. It's a version of the intelligence explosion of good of the mid-60s. I think about the concept of the not yet invented systems and how predicting the future in the past would have caught us out not thinking about these. I just look at the sheer scale of investment. I've heard it said that this technology is attracting more investment than any technology in the history of humanity. I look at the evident market demand. In government and business, people are excited about cutting costs, becoming more productive and so forth. Whether or not this is right, there's an excitement, there's an energy in the market. I look at the vast number of startups with hugely able individuals that are devoted to overcoming some of the shortcomings, and then also breakthroughs in all sorts of different application areas, whether it be health or education or many more areas. And I look more generally at the number of able humans that are being attracted into the field of AI, and I conclude that the hype hypothesis is implausible. It seems to me terribly unlikely, given all these drivers, that within the next couple of years there's going to be an AI winter or a roadblock. I make a tentative prediction. I think we'll have generative AI plus, in one sense, by 2030. I think within the next 5 years, the problems that concern us about hallucinations and bias, I think in one way or another, they'll be overcome. That doesn't mean I know how they'll be overcome, and I know that this sounds highly speculative, but again, I think of the trajectories, I think of the 44 years I've worked in AI, I look at the remarkable individuals who are devoting their energy to this, and I think that's not an unreasonable assumption. And whether it's 2032 or 2030 or 2029 makes no difference. I'm giving you a sense of the broad trend. The key message of the book, in a sense, though, and this isn't a prediction, it's a caution, and I want to choose my words very advisedly because I'm already being misquoted in this point. I think we need to plan for AGI between 2030 and 2035. I'm not saying it will happen, but I'm saying it is a significant enough possibility that for us not to take seriously both the strengths, the advantages, as well as the vulnerabilities and the threats of this technology would be to do a great disservice to our children and our children's children. So I say again, I'm not saying we will have that, but it seems to me, if it's even not full-scale AGI, something that we might call near AGI, is such a possibility that every government, every business, every school, every parent should be asking the question, what if AGI? what would that mean for the services, the products, the activities in which we're engaged? Another way of summarizing this, and this might sound in a way contradictory, but I divide in simple terms AI into short-term AI and long-term AI. Short-term AI is the next few years. And I believe most of the predictions by pundits being made about short-term AI are hugely overstating its impact. However, and more importantly, I believe most of the long-term predictions are hugely understating its impact. Do I think AI will transform humanity over the next 2 or 3 years? I really don't. But as we move into the 30s, do I think we will see signs of fundamental, irreversible, transformational change? I really do. What we're going to see, in my view, over the next few years, and this is short-term AI, and this is why there's such an interest, is the use of AI in an attempt to improve efficiency and productivity and consistency in government service, in business service, and in much else that we do. That is what I call automation. It's not fundamentally changing what we do, it's grafting AI on top of our current activities and practices. And that's what there's such market interest in, and that's what will dominate the next few years. But there's a great danger here in focusing in short-term AI that we're not facing up to the possibilities and the risks of long-term AI. Because investing in automation, essentially what others would call sustaining technologies that support and enhance the current way we're working, does not prepare us at all for the fundamental change that long-term AI is likely to bring. I think when you start looking long-term, we see 3 different things. You see some great and exciting possibilities. You see some things that are weird, and you see some things that are terrifying. I look at the global health crisis. I look at the global access to justice crisis. I look at the global education crisis. I look at the climate crisis. And I can conceive, at least, and in some situations, look at practical examples of how AI will help us overcome these grave difficulties that face humanity. So that's the exciting bit. I also look at the downside, the weaponization of AI. I look at the impact, the likely impact on the labor force. I've studied it for years. I cannot help but conclude that, for example, the professional services market will be fundamentally changed by these technologies. And many firms around the world, their business model will simply be inappropriate in the 30s. And again, I say they're ill prepared for these. But I think the impact on the labor market, as we can see even for some everyday uses of the emerging technology, will mean that many jobs that currently exist will no longer be needed. And I know, of course, there's the argument new jobs will arise. But as Dan and I showed in our research in 2015, saw no evidence that the new jobs that will arise are ones for which humans are better placed than machines. The machines will take on these too. And I wonder we'll see, and this worries me greatly, huge inequalities. We are allowing massive concentrations of power and capital and data in non-state-based organizations with profit motives. And I have no objection to that kind of organization. But when and if so much of our wealth and productivity is dependent on these systems, and again, this is the what if AGI point, we are again ill-prepared, even in our public debate, for the discussions about how the redistribution of wealth would be engineered. How would we sustain an economy in which very few people are working and the wealth is concentrated in the part of very few? It is very interesting because so much that Karl Marx said in his writings can actually be applied again directly in our thinking about the economics of AI. And then there's the weird. In the penultimate chapter of the book, I talk about AI-generated virtual worlds. Again, entirely conceivable that generations of AI systems in the future will produce virtual reality that will, in due course, be indistinguishable in many ways from what we would regard as everyday human experience. But we'll go beyond that, and some are already working in a variety of concepts. But just to mention one that I personally find unsettling, the idea that you might be able to meet your dead parents in virtual reality and talk with them and engage with them in a way that feels remarkably lifelike. And I've lost both my parents, and I don't know what I think about that. I don't know if I'd want that. I've asked my kids what they think, and they wouldn't want that. And it might be because, well, there's a whole bundle of reasons they might not want that. But it is a disconcerting possibility. So I don't really know what I feel, but what I do know is I don't want the decision on whether or not that's a thing to be made by Elon Musk, Sam Altman, or by Mark Zuckerberg. I think we're facing new sets of social, political, economic, legal issues of a profundity we've never had to consider in such a short period of time. And what, again, I'm trying to do in the book is at least clarify the problems. So the fundamental argument of the book in conclusion, the fundamental question I ask is, what if AGI? I think that's the debate we should be having. And I know some people will say that's entirely speculative. AGI is not going to come about. I say again that I think it's a bit like I sometimes refer to the AI asteroid. That we do in so many areas of our lives assess risks, and when there's serious risks, we put plans in place. We don't have the plans in place. So I've been working on AI for more than 44 years, and I've generally been optimistic. For the reasons you can understand from what I said a few minutes ago, I can see how it might solve many of our greatest problems. But I have to say also, as I thought writing a book about AI, I had to look at the risks and the vulnerabilities. And there are a mountain range of them. And so I'm deeply concerned about AI as well. So one of the messages is we have to hold in our heads two thoughts, that this is a set of technologies that could bring massive good, but also could be deeply threatening for us. And that's why I say that saving humanity with and from AI is the defining challenge of our age. Thank you.
Great, Richard. What a wonderful thing to end on, saving humanity with and from AI. The book's incredibly well written and easily accessible, so I don't want to go through all the arguments and hope that people buy it. But you've been working on this and the possibilities of technological change in law for 44 years. And if you read the papers, it seems like law has not really changed. The waiting lists go up to get into court. The number of people who aren't getting access increases. So how do you reconcile the knowledge of what's possible, and I'm talking short-term AI now, and the seeming political impossibility of achieving it? And that's in a very advanced economy like the UK, before one's talking about many developing countries or other places.
In the broadest of terms, and I'm really not alone in thinking this, our court system here and internationally, they're broken in a variety of ways. There's two broad forms of law: criminal law, which you're all familiar with, where someone's committed an offence, or allegedly, and civil law, when you perhaps some kind of claim against someone, but it's not a criminal issue. And I have for long argued, and maintain this to this day, that we can use technology generally, and now AI more specifically, in sorting out, or at least addressing what we call the access to justice problem. That's the problem that for most people, the legal system is unaffordable, inaccessible, unintelligible, and essentially out of step in a digital society. And I look at the processes. There's funny, a very well-known judge once said, any system that's got a 2,000-page user manual has got a problem. And he was referring to the rules of court in our country, which are about 2,000 pages in length. We have to find simplified, better, quicker, cheaper ways. I bet the way
I'm getting at it. I'm not focusing on law because you're a lawyer, a barrister. It's because it seems like a general question as to why technology that exists don't get adopted.
What I was wanting to draw a distinction, I admit I was taking a long run up on this one, but so that's an example where it's just plain obvious to me.
Yeah.
But there's a whole set of activities where it's less obvious. If you take criminal law, there's a performative side to criminal process that many people would say is important. Even if an AI system could outperform a jury, we still want a jury of their peers. So when I look at a lot of what we do, I look at and I draw the distinction in the book between those things where how we do it today is intrinsically important and we preserve it, and how we do it is actually simply instrumentally important. That's to say, how we do it is just to deliver an outcome we want. And what I see across government and across the professions is there are very few examples of intrinsic importance. That's to say, how we work has to be preserved for its own sake. And this is why I think the market is expressing such a great interest in the use of AI. Because although we value much that we do and how we do it, in pure outcome terms, very often we don't need to preserve our ways of working. And that's why, with governments, for example, there's deep attraction. So in medicine, for example, I like to say that people don't want doctors, they want health. If we can find different ways of giving them health, and they might be AI-based health prevention, illness prevention systems, or diagnostic systems, or treatment planning systems, whatever they might be, if we can find different and demonstrably superior ways of delivering health based on AI, I don't think, to use my earlier phrase, markets are going to show loyalty to our traditional ways of working. So my answer is we have to disengage two categories of things we do as humans, those that should be preserved for moral or other reasons, and those that frankly are simply of instrumental importance and we should be applying AI.
And I've got some great research groups here in the Oxford Martin School working on technological and economic change and the future of development, future jobs. And one of the things that we found is that so far we're not seeing any of the productivity improvements as economists that the technologists and others promise and have been promising for a long time out of this. In fact, productivity is slowing down, growth is slowing down. How do you reconcile that all these things that are going to be so effective in making us more effective are not yet being expressed in the market?
I'm very conscious of it.
And of course, people are investing a lot of money, so they want them to be expressed.
I'm very conscious that you're an economist and I'm not. This is an economic question. I was fascinated by two Nobel Prize winners who have entirely different views on this. Michael Spence, who says it'll be a remarkable increase in productivity will arise from AI, and Darren Acemoglu, who says exactly the opposite. So there's clearly contention. As a cynic of economics, I would say I wonder if we're not seeing a change in the figures, I wonder if our metrics are wrong, whether or not because what I see in so many of the businesses I advise, and I think it's a third answer, is it's too early to know, but what I see in the professions and across the firms I'm working, some demonstrable, undeniable savings of time, increase in productivity, whether or not the reorganization and the structure of these businesses has yet been such as to drive changes in the figures, I would doubt. But what I'm seeing on an everyday basis suggests remarkable change in the way we do much that we do, and it's hard for me to think that it won't have some economic benefit. But I do agree, and it's been a long-standing paradox, hasn't it? People say that you see it's seen everywhere but in the figures. We
that's
know
what
that.
Solo, the Nobel Prize winner,
Indeed,
observed
that's right.
long time. Turning to the longer term and AGI, so when we think about our economies in an advanced aging society like the UK, about 70-80% of it is in personal services of various types. Do you see AGI transforming, for example, elderly care? I mean, it'll make people live longer because there'll be health breakthroughs. I understand that. Hopefully there'll be breakthroughs in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and dementia coming out of it. And so that will allow more productive older lives. But are there things that we do that we're just going to carry on wanting to do? So we're going to want our slow meals to be slow. We're going to want our massages to take an hour. We're going to want our walks in the countryside to do what they are. We're going to want people to look after our elderly parents and our children as they do. And we won't want faster piano lessons. So where do you see AGI absolutely transforming the way that people relate to people in a relatively wealthier, older society like the UK?
It's funny how you mentioned, just to pick one of to drill down to one example of it, and I know you're poking fun. about having faster piano lessons, but wouldn't it be amazing to have in your home the world's finest piano teacher, to actually have someone interacting with you as would one of the finest piano teachers? Now, I don't know where that appears in the I don't know where that
more frustrating.
I don't know where that appears in the figures. I go back to, as often I do, to Japan, where they have a crisis with nurses and they use robotic nurses. And pretty overwhelmingly, the feedback's positive about, and one may think this is strange, but people feel these systems are providing them with company. What's one of the top uses of AI just now? And again, one might contest it, but AI for therapy purposes. The idea of having AI companions, as was worked on in the Oxford Internet Institute many years ago, that are highly capable, friendly entities that are attuned to your needs, that can keep you company, I find a deeply attractive solution to some of the social care problems we have. Am I saying that it would be better to have a little robot than your grandchild or your daughter in helping you? Of course, I'm not saying that, but I distinguish between need that is poorly met today and need that's unmet, and I think a lot of unmet need will be met by these systems. I think again it's hard to anticipate, and it depends how much time one spends interacting even with today's systems. But I have the very strong sense, and I know it's irrational, when I'm interacting with these systems, that it's not just ones and zeros. I do say please and thank you. I do feel like apologizing for troubling it again with a daft question. And these systems are the least capable we'll ever be from now on. And so what we have to do is project ahead and imagine, and I know this sounds science fictional, but it's the thought experiment, it's to get you in the right mindset. Imagine humanoids that are perhaps even indistinguishable. Robotic technology is lagging here, but just imagine the concept that perform as human beings do. And it should open our minds to entirely new ways of living. It raises very interesting questions about what humanity is for. But I think try not to think about these issues in terms of ChatGPT on your handheld. You need to allow a flight of imagination.
Yeah, and the book's fantastic for that, because having read many, many books on this, I think what you do so admirably is paint the canvas of possibilities without really pushing us to focus on any one, and that puts the responsibility on all of us to think deeply. And you highlight the risks as well in your chapter on risks, which I think are vital unless we get engaged, as you said at the end. This can overrun us.
The risk is an interesting thing, because I, rightly or wrongly, I haven't focused much on risks over the years. I've been really looking at the upsides. So I thought I should really write something about risks. And then I started looking, and I'm not being critical of computer scientists or cognitive science or AI people, but when I looked at the current analysis, it's a kind of mishmash, and I thought, actually, we can do a better categorization of that. So I say, and I racked my brains and looked at what everyone has written. I said, actually, there's 7 categories of risk here. They overlap a little bit. But what I was trying to do, again, was not say there aren't any risks and not say here's the problem, but at least be clear that there's different categories of risk which require, and for me this is important, different kinds of regulatory or legislative response. Just keep piling them all into a big bucket and saying there's lots of risk in AI takes us nowhere.
And there's a massive job to be done in managing. Great, we have about half an hour for Q&A. If you put up your hands, there's some roving mics. This is being filmed and webcast, so if you don't want to be filmed and webcast, don't ask a question, is my suggestion.
Or indeed, don't defame anyone, that's the other thing.
From what I read, and I'm no expert in this, the amount of energy that these AI systems consume is enormous.
Huge.
And will be growing more enormously. Do you see that as a built-in limitation, or as creating political conflict about the priorities to which that energy can be used?
Okay, thanks.
Very good. We'll collect a few questions. Just going back on this side, anyone? All right, let's flip over. Oh, sorry, yeah.
So my question has to do with the relation between machine learning and the way humans learn. And I wonder if you think that they are fundamentally the same, if these transformer models are just actually rather imprecise simulations and only superficially identical, or if they are both special cases of a more general kind of learning? And does it matter?
Yeah. One more. Anyone else on this side? No. One, you, Chris, there's a hand right at the back there on this side, and then we'll come forward on this side.
Yes, I was very interested, especially with your legal background, about what you think the implications are for copyright, which I know is a very hot topic at the moment.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. And Richard was a copyright barrister.
I knew a bit about it.
Yeah. Why did you answer those three?
Okay, let me take the second one first. And here I go back to what I said at the beginning about Kissinger and Chomsky, because it turns out Kissinger is an outcome thinker and Chomsky is a process thinker. And I think there's two fundamentally different views of AI to be found amongst AI in the AI community. So the process thinkers, and neither's right nor wrong, I liken it to C.P. Snow's distinction between art and science. They're just different cultures. There's a whole set of people who are interested in process, really two dimensions. One, how do these machines work? And secondly, how does the brain work? And there's a kind of third issue about how do these two relate to one another. And then there's a whole set of issues about what are the outcomes of these, what do these systems do? There are legal implications, there are economic implications, there are business implications, there are social implications and so forth. And it's two entirely different ways of looking at the phenomenon. So at one level, the answer to your question is you said, does it matter? If you're an outcome thinker, you say it doesn't actually matter. The fact is that system can produce unbelievable limericks, remarkable line drawings. It can cut code like nothing on earth. And how it does it is not my concern. As a business person, I'm just amazed it can do it. That others would say, and this is the Chomsky point, that these systems are, they're a very crude, at best, it's a metaphor, calling them neural networks. The human brain and the mind are wildly more complex. And I'm not sure often where that process thinking takes you, because a lot of people in the end will say, you may have heard people say, well, you know, in the end it's ones and zeros, or in the end it's computational statistics, or in the end it's just autocomplete. You'll have heard everyone saying that. That's process thinking. That's trying to clarify the issue in terms of how it does it. But the reality is autocomplete, ones and zeros, can actually be used as weaponized AI, could actually threaten people's jobs and so forth. So my first observation is we need, on one view, it doesn't matter if you're an outcome thinker. And my own view is not unlike as regards the process, from what little I do know about neuroscience and the brain, and from my own thinking and philosophy of mind, I think we're dealing with very different entities here. As I say, a lot of the work that uses the metaphorical language, and we use it all the time, talking about machines thinking and all the rest of it, or why does can a machine be creative, can it exercise judgment? All of these kind of questions, these are all kind of quite processy questions, because that's how the human being creates something new or handles uncertainty. I really do think that we as humans and machines operate quite differently. And in fact, Dan and I came up with this idea we call the AI fallacy, and that's the mistaken belief that the only way to get a machine to do something intelligent or partly intelligent is somehow to replicate the way that humans work. And we don't think replication is necessary at all. As a famous AI scientist once said, there's many ways of being smart that aren't smart like us, many ways of producing smart outcomes. So my short answer is I think they're very different, but there is a sense, certainly in some debates, if you're very outcome focused, that question might not matter to you. The copyright question, gosh, it's a huge one. So there's a huge public debate just now, prompted by lots of fame. I keep on wanted to write an article about this, but just know I'll annoy many of my heroes. But there's a lot of authors and musicians who are complaining about their content being used in the development of these AI systems and saying this is unfair. I think the first thing to say is funny that we're using an 18th century concept to have this discussion, and that's the concept of copyright, both of which came into English and American law in the 18th century. You can trace it in English law. back to the mid-16th century. But in any event, they were all responses to the advent of the printing press. So copyright was a phenomenon that really emerged when printing came along. And one of my general points is and I've done work in this earlier, on one view, there's been 4 stages of human development. The age of orality, where we could only communicate by speaking. The age of script, where we could write and we had hieroglyphics and other symbolic representations through pen. Then was the age of print, and now the age of digital, or however one might want to look at it. But what's very interesting is if you look at so many of our institutions, take law, for example, legislation and legal profession and judges, as you move from one of these phases to another, it all fundamentally changes. So I anticipate that we will fundamentally change and will need to change the way we look at intellectual property, how we protect ideas, how we protect expressions of ideas. I do appreciate what the performers are saying, or the authors are saying. They're saying, hang on a second, someone's making money out of me in one way or another and I'm getting no payback. That doesn't seem fair. Others are saying, if you're not a leading artist, say you're someone, I had this conversation over the weekend with someone who writes the music to accompany TV dramas. He said he can pretty quickly imagine his work being replaced by AI. So there's going to be a loss of work there. And there's a little bit of not us thinking there as well. Well, you know, it really doesn't, we'll never really have, we are the prime form of entertainment. Whereas I think we need to do some what if AGI thinking. And we can imagine, say, in 10 years' time, or maybe longer, an entirely different world of entertainment and of culture, where, for example, we can have movies based on the system's knowledge of our personal preferences, which will be produced, personalized for us, and we will enjoy many times more than movies we enjoy today, or music that's personalized. All of this, you just, again, need to show a little bit of imagination, at least imagine it conceptually. And then you start thinking the questions, maybe not so much, what does this mean for the producers, but what does it mean for the recipients, and what does it mean for our economy? And what I want the UK economy to be is a leading player in the global AI market. And I don't think we do that by leaning immediately for our 18th century concepts and saying the prime thing to do is preserve what we do today. And again, I'm not saying I've got the answer, but I want a wider debate. I want a more nuanced discussion. Remind me the first question.
Energy.
Energy, yes. And it's a deep problem. It is certainly true these systems seem to consume unholy amounts of energy, and that is a problem. I think the flip side of the computing resource issue that I mentioned is that as these systems, as the underpinning technologies improve, and one has to think about technologies like quantum and other technologies there, as these technologies advance, the amount of power they may require may be decreased. So you might say there'll be a millionfold, compute will increase a millionfold. I think the flip of that is you could do the same processings today for a millionth of the energy. That's a terribly approximate observation. But the question is, can our advance in technology outstrip the amount of energy it consumes? So that, and I don't know the answer to that. I think that's just the way we're going to look at it. What I also think is interesting, though, and this is we've seen this in wartime, and we see it. People call it innovation under constraint. Isn't it interesting that a few of the really big AI players are looking at their own private nuclear plants to power these? And whereas the putting in place a nuclear plant by the state is a project that takes many, many years, we're seeing that, and of course there are safety and other concerns, but isn't it interesting how that's requiring these businesses who are energy conscious to crack their corner of the energy challenge? So wouldn't it be an irony if trying to power these AI systems accelerates our search for viable alternative energy resources? That's me being optimistic.
Okay, we're going to come to this room. This is the right-hand side of the room shortly, but first we're going to go online. And Sir Charles Godfrey, who's the current director of the school, is very kindly offered to be the online question reader.
Thank you, Ian. And actually, the question from Matthew Stainer comes directly after this gentleman's question. And he asked you to explore the idea, what happens if atomic fusion works? And of course, that could be facilitated by AI. And what would a world look like with modern AI and essentially free energy?
Any experts in atomic fusion in the audience would be my first. I'm 64. I'm not going to pretend I can answer a question I can't. I don't know the answer to that. I just don't know the answer to that question. I know certainly the first part of the question. The extent to which energy is a current constraint is not clear. I'm not hearing people in the AI community saying that energy is the stumbling block to great advance. I think the observation that was made in the question, the deep concern that this is at a time when we're trying to conserve energy, this seems disproportionately consumptive. That's the exam question, I think. But I've not heard, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, that there are many breakthroughs we could enjoy if only we could deploy more energy. But as for that particular enabling technology, I can't answer the question.
Great. All right. Thanks, Charles. Person in front here, and then behind you.
Thank you. So I think as humans, we have a great survival instinct. So I don't know whether we'll get to the stage where we become pets to these machines. But having said that, do you think it's possible to regulate AI given how fast it's evolving? We talk about regulation and ethics and all of that. But
well, there's so many different questions.
The person behind you?
Is it possible?
Okay, and then that person, right, yeah.
I would say...
Let's collect a few questions.
Okay, I struggle to remember them.
I'll remind you.
I'm going through my own mind what I'm going to say to...
Had McKinsey in to get the most efficient question answering system. Batch of 3. I was just going to ask about the frame of the notion that it's nice to have some of these things because, for example, they might mitigate loneliness. As someone who both was at Harvard for the birth of Facebook and in meetings with Takeda as they made amphetamines to help people with distraction, I just sometimes wonder if we're being given solutions to problems of our own making. And of course, isn't it great to have a chatbot that stops you from feeling lonely if you don't have friends and you don't go and play sport at school? And that's something I see every day in patients as a GP, children, an astonishing number of children who are not going out to hang out with their friends. But isn't it great that they don't feel lonely because they have access to chatbots? And that frame, when sort of continued forward, feels like it could be very distracting because it will apply to everything. And I don't exactly know what the solution to it, but I find it very disconcerting. Interested to know your thoughts.
Did you have a question? Okay, next one back. Who else would like to ask a question? The person over there?
You raised at the end the whole question, essentially, we'll call it the Elon Musk question. And it seems to me that's not that far off. In fact, we're there now. I mean, do you have any thoughts about how we can find a way through the fact that our political systems now don't seem to be well set up to handle a small number of very rich, very powerful people who increasingly control access to knowledge and ideas?
The first and the third questions are very similar in a way, and that is the extent to which our policymaking and legislative and regulatory processes and institutions are equal to the job. And it won't surprise you to hear, I think they're absolutely not. And using my earlier analysis, as we move from one phase of humanity, from the print-based society to the digital society, we should expect we need fundamental new institutions. It won't do that it takes us 10 years to work out what the law should be in emerging technology. And I want to say it really strongly, it really won't do. And we're seeing this with the AI Act just now in Europe, how long it's taken and how many years, and in the end, with the greatest of respect, how many marks it misses. We have to entirely rethink, and this is the work, I don't know if you mentioned, but this is the work that my son Jamie has done in his 2 books called Future Politics and the Digital Republic. We need entirely different conceptions of political process, of democratic engagement, of political institutions, because we simply cannot use what we have today. When I look at the quality of discussion in the Houses of Parliament over the issue we were discussing earlier, people are mugging up on who knows where, so they understand a little bit about copyright and a little bit about the internet. We neither have the deep thinking or the expertise to underpin good policy making, in my view, in our parliamentarians, or there's a handful of exceptions, nor do we have processes which enable us to get from problem to solution at a rate that is suitable. And so one of my big problems, the regulation, is that I say in the book, the genie is halfway out the bottle. I think I say, and I think quite a number of people agree, we've probably got to get our act together within 10 years if we're wanting to remain in control of these technologies. And I know that sounds melodramatic. Lots of people might want to say it's overstatement. But if you think what if AGI, if we get to AGI, we need to think through, this is why I say, what if AGI? We'd think, what law and regulations would we want in place if systems are performing at that level? So we don't have the institutions. Is it possible to regulate? I think we've seen with something like GDPR, for example, in Europe, it was a long journey to get there. It's quite a good example of a very high impact regulation.
Maybe just spell it out for people.
Oh, that's the data protection regulation in Europe, which actually has global reach and has affected the transnational flow of data and the use of personalized data quite profoundly. So can humans make laws that have impact and bite? Yes. Do we have the processes and get them in place quickly? No. Do we have the political institutions that can somehow sensitively and quickly reflect the mood of the people and also reflect the change? Because people's views on this are changing so rapidly. We haven't begun to think through. And I've seen no evidence. I would say, for example, the judiciary I advised for 25 years, a wonderful institution, and our judges really are amongst the finest globally. And many judges say, well, the great thing about the English common law system is that it'll be sufficiently flexible that it can evolve the law in this area. But big cases take about 5 years to go through our court system. Whether or not a really important point of law reaches the courts or goes right through the courts is often a matter of luck or a matter of commercial concern rather than a matter of principle and policy. We have a set of institutions which are suitable for the print-based society, but not for the current society. So our political or legal institutions need to be revisited. Again, we're not having that conversation. We're having conversations about whether or not AI systems will give rise to risks. Of course they do. We know that these systems make mistakes, but to limit that as the scope of our change, this is where, this is my big plea, this is where our country that has led the way in political thinking and has for centuries have institutions, our judiciary, our parliament, of which we've been proud. We should be developing the next generation of that. That should be one of our exports, and that should be how we're a beacon in the AI world. Instead, we're becoming the best known in the world for guardrails. I exaggerate. And there is a real push in our current government, our current minister, I think it has exactly the right idea, but we're seeing in microcosm, what you're seeing from the entertainment industry, the response of the threat to AI, we'll see it in so many different sectors, and that is why I'm not at all approving of Trump releasing the handbrake as he's done, and he's saying no regulation. Of course, we have to think sensibly about regulation, but we run the risk of running around in circles thinking about how we restrict this new technology. On the question that you use a GP, the question, there's a little bit of a notion that, and I'm not saying you were saying this, but to some extent AI is the next disastrous chapter of the story of technology for kids. Earlier chapters with social media, games and so forth, and AIs and other. I don't think they're the same book. I think, and I'm not saying you were saying it was, I think this is something entirely different. But I think it raises the age-old question of the extent to which parents can become involved in using technologies that are good and bad. And I have no more answers for that than we've had down the years, but it does seem to me that the kinds of practices that when my kids were young, and lots of us thought deeply about this, about where they could use machines in the house, how much access they have, what is a positive use of this technology, what's not. We need to think this through, and in our schools and in our homes, we need to offer guidance to our kids. So I don't see in this sense that the technology is fundamentally offensive. I think in good measure, it could be, for example, the most wonderful educational tool, but at the same time, it could, as you fear, it could draw people away from social interaction, which we all think is really important.
Okay, there were some other hands. Is there more online as well? More questions online?
Ask me another one about atomic fission.
Yeah, the person over here.
So when it comes to planning and preparing for AGI, how do you say that we lawyers should be allocating our resources, particularly time, given that the timeline doesn't feel very long?
So I didn't quite catch that bit. As lawyers, how should you allocate your resources in relation to AGI?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Any more questions? The two hands at the back, and then we'll come here. And then I think that'll probably take us to the end.
Thank you.
Is anyone burning on?
Another question on preparedness. How should we be changing our education systems so that we can work constructively with new AI systems, spot the problems when they occur, but learn to use them well?
Okay.
Thank you.
Other hand was.
I was going to ask you to predict when you think we might have fully self-driving cars in the United Kingdom, and what lessons we can take from that, whatever you think about that, towards general AI or other things.
Okay, and the final question in the front row here. No, just wait for the microphone.
Yeah, I mean, looking ahead, really ahead, a direct link with AI to the brain, is that a feasible conception?
Good. Over to you.
Well, there's lots of work going on in that. I mean, even if you look, again, Elon Musk, his work in Neuralink is exactly. So there's a huge investment in that area. It's quite interesting. Lots of scientists often say something. I often say the world of AI is littered with nevers, where people say that'll never happen until it does. And I was completely amazed when I read, as I said, about this idea of electrodes attached to the brain. Doesn't seem to me it is conceptually a mammoth leap, technically maybe, but a mammoth leap to imagine that machines may in some way link wirelessly. And I have no idea how that would happen, and it sounds science fictional, but it seems for us to reject that as a possibility would be inconsistent with the trajectories we're seeing. On the question of education, sorry to keep on quoting my family, but I'm about to plagiarize my son Daniel's writing a new book on what our children will do. And what he says is we have to rethink how we teach, what we teach, and when we teach. And he always points out that if you go into a classroom today, it's not fundamentally different from a classroom about 100 years ago. Same kind of desk, the stage and the stage, same kind of model. There might be a whiteboard, but it's not fundamentally different. And with the idea of personalized learning and the availability of, and we will have it under AGI if that comes about, of remarkable personal tutors, it's an entirely different world. So how we teach will change. What we teach, the question for me is, what are we training young people to become? A lot of our education process is training people to become an X, Y, or Z. If X, Y, or Zs aren't going to be needed, then we need to think deeply, what kind of humans are we preparing? And when we teach is fascinating because we did have this traditional view that what we do in education in life is front load our education. You do it at the beginning and that should do you. That should carry you through for the remainder of your life. We'll need to revisit that as well. On the question of law, I think you're talking about law firms, I suspect, and as all professional firms, I think there's two paths of activity to disengage. One is the short-term work of AI. You can say, well, what we do, how today can we use these systems? And it might be quite basic things like summarizing documents or summarizing meetings or drafting papers or whatever it is. You need to disengage that work, which for me is business as usual, the work of a chief operating officer, and the longer term strategic stuff, which is to say, given the likely development of this technology, what value are we going to be able to bring, given who we are, given our brand, given the relationships we have? Trouble is a lot of people are just mashing all of this AI stuff into one. Tends to be a short-term focus, and I think there is a worry and issue about the sustainability of the business model. So for the next few years, it looks as if the business model is quite well enhanced by this technology. But I think one-to-one consultative advisory service charged by the hour will reach the end of the runway towards the end of the decade. Now, there's another question. There was a fourth question.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Was that
self-driving
car? That was a question about
cars.
self-driving cars. Has anyone in the room been in a self-driving car? Okay, so not many. I mean, I wasn't sure if your question was entirely serious. Were you saying that they don't work or they haven't been adopted?
What's the lessons?
Okay, the UK. Okay. Well, then that's the advanced adoption distinction. But I was in California. I told Ian the story earlier, actually, or told someone the story. I was just completely amazed when I went in a self-driving car. I've written about these things, but somehow I thought they were probably operating still in big car parks and there's someone still at the wheel. But you actually sit in a car and the steering, it's like being driven by the invisible man. There's no one in the driving seat. And to make it concrete, we were being driven back, and my wife and my daughter in the car, and we were being driven back by from the Golden Gate Bridge, and we're going around this curve, which is quite sharp. And we're going a lot faster than I would go driving around a sharp curve when there's a fall of about a sheer drop of maybe 400 or 500 feet on one side. And that makes you think quite acutely about machine learning and how the systems develop. I suppose later on I did think, I suppose the question is, what's the risk of that compared to, for example, a taxi driver having a heart attack or whatever? And I'm sure the insurers have looked into this, but I suggest for all of you who are thinking about self-driving cars, sit in one, and then it's quite interesting. Your theory about self-driving cars after you've sat in one is very different from before you sat in one. But isn't it an interesting example of a technology that is therefore working, and there's been very few accidents with, and yet the uptake is not that rapid? And I understand there's been, in the UK, I think there's a couple of companies that are getting licenses to operate in limited areas. But it's a good illustration, I think, the question of this idea that even if we have the technology, for a whole bundle of reasons, it doesn't mean they'll be in place. In the long run, though, I think it's hard to imagine that, for example, when one looked at the business case for self-driving taxis, rather than having a fleet of employees, the business case is very compelling. And so this is a good example of people just not quite thinking through, well, what does this mean for all the sectors in the long run that have human beings in jobs that are related to driving? And it turns out, for example, in the United States, there's entire towns in the United States, their only reason for existence is as stop-off points for people who are traveling through. And one may not need them in the future. I think it does, it's one of my answer to this question was one of the reasons I said the genie is not entirely out of the bottle. I think it'll take us a longer to adopt a lot of these technologies, even if they are available. As against that, we do know there are other countries, and most notably China rather, that are moving at a remarkable rate. But your question highlights that distinction. Advanced does not equate to adoption. Oh, sometime in, you mean in operation at all, or I would say it's going to be the 30s. I don't think it's this.
There really are self-driving cars coming out of Oxford University. I wouldn't go there just yet, though. Great, Richard. Thank you so much for.
Thank you.
A wonderfully stimulating conversation, which could go on, and I'm sure it will go on over a drink. I encourage you to get the book, and this debate is absolutely central to the issues we'll be dealing with, and so delighted that we could have it at the Oxford Mind School, which is all about the big challenges of this century. So thank you all for coming. Thank you. And if you found this of interest, do keep an eye on the website. It's the end of term now, so things are beginning to become less frequent, but they'll become more frequent again in the autumn. So welcome you back then, and thank you, Richard.